I invited Alex to come speak. I'll give a quick little intro for him before he can, go and talk about everything. So I actually, way back, it feels like nowadays, Alex was an AI resident while I was at FAIR and worked on we worked on like grounding action language in the text-adventure game space, which was some pretty cool stuff at the time. And since it seems he's been continuing to work in the realm of like how to use data to accomplish, this type of like storytelling world, which is kind of difficult to do, especially in long context and when you're trying to keep all this stuff together. You guys recently expressed some interest in one of the papers that he shared, so I invited him to talk with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Let's see if I can share my screen correctly. Let me know if it shows up for you.
Yeah, here we go.
Okay, then yeah, I'll just get started unless there's any other preamble you guys need to do. Okay, sounds good. So yeah, this is our recent paper I did as part of my PhD at the University of Edinburgh. I'm advised by Marella Lapata. It's called Learning to Reason for Long-Form Narratives. As a bit of a brief overview, like Jack mentioned, I do a lot of work in long-form story generation, next chapter prediction. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the beginning, sort of justifying why I think this task is interesting, what makes it hard, and hopefully giving you some intuition about the challenges of this space and how they might apply to other spaces as well. Then I'll talk about how our approach specifically draws on inspiration from more of the reasoning and RL side of things. I'll talk about our results. And then if we have time, I don't know, I think it's about an hour. This presentation should not take an hour, so hopefully we will have time. This work was quite a long project. It took us about a year. So there's a lot of small things we've thought about and tried. So they're not in the paper. If we have time, it might be interesting to kind of talk about them a little bit. Just, a small tidbit you can't get just from reading the paper. Yeah, and also feel free to stop me. There will be about 3 natural places, I think, for questions, but if I forget, or if you just have a question that needs to be answered, then feel free to stop me and ask me whatever. So yeah, to get started, we'll talk about long-form story generation, next chapter prediction, why it's hard. Most of the name gives you most of it away. What is long-form story generation? It's generating long-form stories. There are 2, I think, useful caveats though. The first is you're not generating a story from scratch. There's usually some context or some premise. This paper on the right has sort of a high-level story premise that they use, and then they have this memory enhancement model. The premise in most work looks like a brief kind of introduction about what the story will be about. So tell me a long story about someone who gains the power to fly or something very high level. For our task, we have a much more in-depth context where we're trying to infill parts of a book. And so our context is a lot of other information that has already happened or will happen in the book. The other caveat is that what people mean by long when it comes to long-form story generation varies a lot. I tend to say long when you're generating over 2,000 tokens, but there are, some people say, oh, if you're generating like around 1,000 words, that still counts as long. There's another caveat to this, which is you can generate thousands of tokens at once, or you can generate it in chunks, which might seem more reasonable, but there's some, drawbacks to that approach. This paper on the right, as you might see in their bottom diagram, they have this loop where they write some content and then they update their outline, and this allows them to scale up to around 7,000 tokens. For our task, we're looking at around 100,000 tokens, but we're generating in small chunks, like I mentioned, for each chapter. So the big sort of reason I think it's interesting to work in this space is that it's hard. Of course, it's annoying because it's hard and it hurts, my ability to come up with projects very quickly. And so my thesis may be pushed back as a result, but I think it's very interesting because it's hard. And there's 3 big reasons why it is. The first is the context length. So as opposed to other, let's say, factual QA type tasks or math tasks, the context in this domain is very long and importantly, is not easily retrieved over. So while I might have a factuality benchmark where it might require retrieving a couple of disparate facts across some Wikipedia articles, when you're reading a book, you get this really rich implicit understanding of what the world looks like, of the character relationships, of all of the small pieces that make this world feel rich that you need to reason over to generate the next section. This is not like, oh, I just say, the current president is whoever, and then you just retrieve that fact. The second reason this domain is hard is because evaluations are notoriously difficult. So this can be very subjective, what makes a story good. There are, if you've ever taken a writing class, You will get a grade. This does exist. But saying objectively this story is a 5 out of 10 is kind of meaningless. And it's usually there's a lot more context needs to be given to say whether a story is better than another. So for example, you might be in a English literature class, which requires you write an essay in a specific way. There's a rubric that says your paper is good in some specific way. In practice, what people normally do in this domain is pairwise evaluations. So very similar to if any of you have looked at how we do alignment or like Chef, classically you'll have a prompt and two continuations or multiple continuations, and you'll get people to rank them or say which one is better. And this is nice because it abstracts a lot of the sort of fuzzy metrics people have. You might say, oh, I want a story to be creative, but how creative do you really want it to be? So being able to do pairwise comparisons is nice. However, it is very time intensive and very expensive to compute because you're asking people, especially for our task, to read thousands of words at a time. And so it's on the orders of often tens of dollars as opposed to, some cents for every single data point. This is further compounded by the fact that we don't have a great existing data set that makes sense to use for a lot of long form tasks. People used to use this writing prompts data set. I think some people still do. That came out, I think, in 2018. But when we're really scaling to, especially for us, book length generations, finding truly unseen books is very hard. When I say truly unseen, what I mean is not only do we not want books whose text is in the dataset, we also don't want books who are talked about in the dataset. So for example, let's say Quen model might not have seen the exact text of The Great Gatsby or of Harry Potter or whatever, but it's definitely seen people talk about those books. And so it will have an idea of what is in those books already, and trying to generate a continuation is difficult to evaluate whether it's just remembering things that it's previously seen about those books. And then secondly, public data sets are very hard to come by for books, in part because you have this data contamination issue, but also because you're trying to respect copyright and you can't just publish people's books without their permission. Completely hypothetically, if you were to download all of LibGen and just train on that, you could probably get better performance. But one, you shouldn't do that. And two, you're going to get sued into oblivion if you ever try and release that as a public data set. So these are, I think, a good intuition about what is hard here. I am interested in what makes these things hard, and so we chose one of the harder versions of this task, which is book length generation. But surprisingly, there's not much work in this domain, and so we propose, I think, a fairly natural continuation or a more evaluatable version of this task, which is to predict chapters at a time. You could easily imagine how you have a bunch of chapters in a row, you call it a book, but you can evaluate individual chapters without requiring people read the entire book to tell whether it's good. There's another caveat here, which is that instead of operating on the raw story text, we take some inspiration from previous story understanding works, which don't use this very sparse level of raw story text and instead use compressed representations. You can think of this like instead of operating on a very long 100,000 token book, you instead operate on 20,000 tokens of compressed information. And I'll give examples of what this compressed information looks like. And then we use a dataset of 30 books published in the past year, again, for data contamination issues. I'm keeping what the story generator looks explicitly vague here because I'll get into it later. But I think the core idea is fairly straightforward. You have a book, you chunk it up into chapters, you get some story information for each of these chapters, you pass those to your generator, which produces the next chapter. What those?
Sorry, quick
Oh yeah,
question. What's the darker or the more saturated purple boxes like story sketch, summaries, character sheets? Does that color denote something, in the way the previous chapter is like colored differently from the rest of those?
Yeah, so the darker purple is a compressed representation. So I'll go in the next
Okay.
slides to say what they are, but yeah, the
Okay.
darker it's like a
Okay.
richer color. I don't know. I chose
Okay.
darker purple. Yeah. So yeah, just to quickly go over those, these compressed representations are largely based on gold standard summaries because we can get those per chapter, which is a nice way of increasing the fidelity of them. The first one is the global story sketch. This is a high-level summary of the entire book. You can think of it like an author's sketch for what the book will contain, but is very light in details. The next is prior story summaries. This is a summary of what has previously happened in the book already. Then you have character sheets. This comes from our previous work where we have things like character goals, physical and personality descriptions, and so on, just for the top 3 characters. And then we have the previous chapter. This is in light purple in the last slide. This is just raw story text. We find it still useful to include this previous chapter for stylistic information, which is hard to describe neatly, and is also useful for very local information. So what has just happened in the previous chapter requires the most amount of detail, and so we use this very, even though it's sparse, it's still very useful raw story text for the previous chapter. And then finally, we have the next chapter synopsis, which is the high-level summary of the next chapter. In practice, this is just a gold standard summary for the next chapter. And so the concern is, does this just give the whole game away? Is just enough information to write the next chapter? And you don't have to read this whole table, but the high-level answer is no, because it's significantly shorter. And we have some examples in the paper. But the next chapter we're asking to generate is around 2,500 tokens. And the next chapter synopsis is about 150 tokens. So it's about 5% of the size. And in practice, the stories you get generated or the chapters you generate using this synopsis and all of this information vary wildly. So there isn't a clear, this is definitely the chapter you're supposed to be generating. It doesn't tell you all the plot information or the character beats and so on. So now we have our task. The question is, how should we approach this task? And is there a robust way we can approach it? And so
may I ask a question here before you continue?
Sorry.
So the way you curated this information about the next chapter is that you pass this chapter to this super summary model, or like?
Sorry, so Super Summary is a study
how do you
website.
label this chapter this way?
Yeah, so Super Summary is a study website that has these human written per chapter summaries. And then for the global story set and prior story summaries, we further summarize these down into around 2,000 tokens. This compression step is somewhat lossy. You lose some information, but the hope is that by using as a base the gold standard human summaries, those base for the compressed representations will include useful plot information. So some common problem you get when you just use your model to summarize the book is it will highlight correct things that happened, but that aren't necessarily important for the whole story. But because these come from these human annotators, the hope is they're higher quality because they will include, for example, important pieces of information that don't seem locally relevant, but do become relevant at the end of the book. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions here on the data? Okay, cool. We can always come back to it. So yeah, we are taking a look at the previous literature on long-form story generation, and the vast majority of it is prompting. So these will have some prior idea about usually how human authors write books or write stories because they don't operate on books. And they will try and prescribe those via prompts into a way of generating high-quality continuations. So for example, this paper on the left, this detailed outline control paper from 2 years ago, they have a prompt to go from a premise to an outline, and then they prompt to generate some potential event candidates, they prompt to do filter and re-ranking, and so on and so on. And then more modern works, instead of calling it prompting, they call it agents, but it's essentially the same thing. These are untrained models that are just prompted to operate on specific parts of the writing process. So you'll have a planning agent that specifically works on characters. You'll have a writing agent that specifically works on following actions. And these take our prior ideas about what writing should look like, and they apply it to whatever their task is. The problem is twofold. One is just because we think this is the best way for the models to write these continuations doesn't necessarily mean it is. We would ideally like our models to learn the best way for them to produce good continuations. And then two, these don't generalize very well to our specific task because they are so specifically designed for their task. So we could go through the process of designing the optimal prompt, and we do have a prompting baseline, but this setup is not particularly robust to small variations in the way you want your stories to be written. So that takes us to the reasoning and RL side, where instead we're trying to get a model to more abstractly learn this kind of process, but we don't care about the specifics. It's similar to, you could prompt a model to answer a math question in a very specific way. You say, oh, you should break it into these parts, and maybe we have some intuition about what works best. But as we've seen in the past year or so, what often tends to work best is just train the model on math questions to get better at whatever reasoning steps help it. And so for that, we modify our task slightly. So instead of the standard next chapter prediction where we have our story information, we pass it directly to the story generator, we instead add a policy model which creates a detailed plan. This is in addition to the next chapter synopsis. And the idea is we can optimize this intermediary reasoning instead of the story generator directly, because we can separate the skills necessary for writing good stories from the skills necessary to creating good plans for stories. So this is like really a design decision. You could also optimize your story generator, but I think it's a good way of separating the things we want our models to be capable of doing. One of them is figuring out what to write, and one of them is doing the actual writing itself. The problem with this is, how do we actually optimize this policy model? So we have this task. However, as I said before, there's not really a clearly defined reward for this. There's not, this is a good story, this is a bad story. And so most previous work in the RL space relies on super large data sets and also very well-defined rewards. So whether you call DPO an RL paper is up to you, But from this paper, there's this diagram. So very two classical approaches are like Chef and DPO. Both of them use preference data, which might feel very natural. As I mentioned before, this is a classical way we evaluate stories in this setting. However, both of these like operating on very large data sets, and this is more of a rhetorical argument, they both implicitly or explicitly use reward models. Sorry, was there a question? No.
No.
Both of these explicitly or implicitly use a reward model. And at least in previous literature, reward models are not especially good, or classifiers for story quality are not especially good on long context tasks. So there was a paper, I think from a couple of weeks ago, that works on evaluating story quality between human annotations and if they can train a classifier to do the same thing. This comes from Tu and Chakrabarty, and their context is about 10 times smaller than ours, and they get 75% accuracy. So while that is positive, and it definitely shows the research is going in the right direction, for now at least, reward models are likely to be easily hackable by models. And so we want to ideally have a reward setup that doesn't rely on either a large data set or this potentially fraught reward modeling setup. As I'm sure many of you are aware, for math problems and coding problems and many similar problems, this is not the current way we do things. Instead, we have this concept of verifiable rewards, which has existed for a while, but it's been, I think, rebranded as of late to be this RLVR, reinforcement learning via or with verifiable rewards, where instead of having a reward model, you instead have some correctness measure via some simplistic verification function. So if you imagine you have a math question on the left, this is from the Tulu 3 paper, you have some math question that gets fed to your policy. Your policy produces some amount of reasoning. What that reasoning is, it doesn't really matter, and then some answer. And then you just evaluate that answer to see if it's correct. How you do this evaluation is often fairly straightforward. There's different approaches, but the idea is you get some simple piecewise or binary reward that is then used to update your policy. There's a bunch of recent work that does this, DeepSeek Math and so on. There's also work that works on code. So this diagram on the right, the reinforcement learning via execution feedback, I think from last year, they generate code. And because you can execute code, you can have some public and private tests and use those to get your reward. This is very nice because it doesn't rely on a potentially hackable reward function, and it also scales pretty well depending on what data you have. You can just sample a bunch of times. However, it's not naturally applicable to our task because, as I said, we don't have a clear idea on what the reward should be. However, the sort of core idea of this work is we can make one key assumption and kind of lift a lot of the ideas of this domain and apply it to our task. And the assumption is as follows. So if we have a data set of story information next chapter pairs, and we have some story generator, in our case, it's just a Quen instruct model, we assume that plans that improve the likelihood of the goal completions, or that is plans that improve the likelihood of the next chapter, will also improve the quality of the natural completions. So I think it might be useful to explain some of the intuition here. If you have a plan that, say, predicts the correct plot events that happen in the future, or a plan that particularly highlights some important character details, that may increase the likelihood of the gold completion of the true next chapter. Using that plan then without the goal chapter, just to generate the next chapter, will produce better next chapters that are preferred by human annotators. This is an assumption. We will come back to this, but I think this is one of the core ideas. The way we actually model this improvement is fairly straightforward. We just do % decrease in perplexity compared to a baseline. So if you have a generator and a prompt, in this case, it's the story information, and a goal completion, in our case, it's the next chapter. You generate using your policy some answer, in our case, it's a detailed plan. Then you just define improvement as the % decrease in perplexity of the goal completion given the answer. I'm keeping this in fairly general terms because it doesn't just apply to our task. You can instead apply it to any task where you have these concepts of a prompt completion, which is many data sets, as well as an answer. So the equation at the bottom is our improvement. It starts with the baseline perplexity. This is the perplexity across our story generator of the goal completion given just the prompt, minus our new perplexity. This is the perplexity of the goal completion given both the prompt and the answer, divided again by this baseline perplexity. The idea is some data points are significantly harder than others. Some perplexities are lower. Some chapters are just easier to predict. And so this is a nice way of seeing across training how much you're actually improving on your data set as opposed to just reporting standard perplexity. In practice, if you use GRPO or something, this is normalized anyway. This is a nice way of actually having an interpretable metric. There's another detail, which is this.
Sorry for interrupting you again here, because I think this slide and the previous one maybe are they are very important, and I didn't quite understand actually the way you normalize and you get upload. So could you if possible, could you go back to the previous slide and describe the steps again?
So I didn't catch all of it. How do you like the intuition behind the assumption or?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the idea is I have some story generator, which by default, given the story information, will produce some chapters. And I have some default likelihood of predicting the gold completion. If I produce a new plan about what should happen in this chapter and I give it to the story generator, does this increase or decrease the likelihood of the gold completion? So for example, I might have a
What do you mean
plan.
by plan here?
The plan is in here in this setup. I am being kind of purposefully vague because we don't especially care what the model produces. It would be nice if it produces something intelligible, but we do some reasoning about what should happen in the previous story, and then we say, given all of this previous story information, what should happen in the next chapter? So this could be plot beats, this could be a way of writing the next chapter, this could be specific character interactions, this could be a lot of things. The idea is, sorry?
Is this just like a change to the prompt that goes into Quen 2.5 and these experiments, or what actually gets output by the planning model into the generator model?
Yeah, so the policy model takes in the story information, it outputs some reasoning trace followed by a detailed plan. This is, what should happen in the next chapter, character beats, plot information, whatever. This gets fed to the story generator along with the story information, and then that gets used to generate the next chapter. So
okay, and the plan and the hypothesis is that if I can produce a better plan, I will be able to produce a better next chapter, right?
Yeah, the idea is that a better plan is measured by the likelihood of producing the goal completion or the true next chapter. Does that make sense?
So yeah, and then how do you evaluate the plan? I think that's the next slide, right?
Yeah, so we evaluate it via this improvement metric, which is just a % decrease in perplexity. So let's say my baseline perplexity, just given the story information, is 10 for producing the next chapter. And then I introduce a plan and I include this plan as part of the prompt. And my new perplexity is 9. Then I would have a 10% perplexity improvement.
So you make the generation 2 times, we then resolve the plan, and then you look at the relative improvement in the perplexity based on that, right?
Yeah, I mean, we don't technically generate 2 plans because you're just getting the perplexity, but yes, that's the idea.
Okay.
Are there any other questions here?
Is the policy model parameterized? Is it because you drew it separately in the diagram, but is it parameterized by the story generator?
Yeah, so we have a couple versions of this, which I'll get to in the baselines, but in practice, for us, both of them are Quen instruct models, and then the policy model is trained in a second. You could alternatively set them equal to the same model. So even over the course of training, your story generator is also your policy. But because of this assumption that the skills needed to write nice looking chapter text is different than the reasoning ability, we separate them.
Okay.
Yeah, we have played around with, although we don't have any results in the paper on this, about you could have a very small reasoning model and a very large, or vice versa, a very large story generator model. But in practice for training, if you set the model used, the story generator for calculating the perplexity equal to your reference model, it allows you to not load an additional model during training, which is just nice in terms of saving compute. All right. Is anyone any other questions, or I can move on? There'll be another point in a couple of slides which will show the whole piece altogether, and maybe that's a good place for questions. All right. So how we define our reward is a simple piecewise function. We show some other options because these hyperparameters look fairly arbitrary, but we have a reward function that's naively based on our improvement, and then how we actually train, or sorry, we generalize this method into what we call VRCLI, which is verifiable rewards via completion likelihood improvement. This is maybe also a useful diagram for getting some of the confusions mixed up or resolved. You have some prompt completion dataset. You pass your prompts into your policy. You can think of these, in our case, as story informations, but they could also just be math questions. They could be whatever. From this, you generate reasoning traces and your answers. These answers, as well as the prompts and the completions, get passed to your generator, which computes your improvement, which again is just the % improvement in perplexity. And then your reward is some simple function based on this improvement, which is in turn used to update your policy. And as I mentioned before, we set our generator equal to our reference, which we already need for KL divergence. So we don't have to load any additional model, but you don't have to do this. It's nice in terms of training. How we actually optimize this is with GRPO. This diagram will look very similar to people who read the DeepSeek math paper because it's just GRPO, but with our stuff stamped on top of it. So we have our prior story information, which goes to our policy model. Our policy model produces a group of outputs. Each of these outputs contains a reasoning trace and a detailed plan. These outputs are passed first to the reference model to compute KL divergence, as well as to VRCLI, which is used to compute our rewards. These rewards are converted into advantages and used to update our policy model. This is like in a slide, the thing we do. So I think maybe if people have questions about what we do, this is the slide to ask them. But otherwise, I can move on to talk about our baselines.
Wait, yeah, I have one question. I might have actually, I'm not. I might have missed this information, but so you're computing the perplexity. So for the reward, you're computing the perplexity over some like ground truth next chapter.
Yeah.
How do you generate the ground truth?
The ground truth isn't generated, it comes from our book dataset. So we have our book dataset that we chop up into chapters, yeah, and then we just take the next chapter as the goal. Yeah.
So so for the final like self-generated data that you're training this over, do you include the ground truth like next chapter as a part of the yeah, so are you like generating up to like next chapters like n-1 and then you append the ground truth chapter and utilize that as a, or is that what is that what the RL pipeline is doing, or is it only training on the like the self-generated portion?
So we only train on the ground truth data that we get from the books directly. So we have all of this actually I'll go forward. We have all of this prior story information that is generated from the ground truth books. In practice, you could do what you mentioned, where you sort of generate one chapter, update the story information, and then generate the next chapter. We don't do this because the evaluating those whole books is bad. And to be honest, it would produce quite bad books that I don't think anyone wants to read anyway. But in practice, in theory, you could do this. What we train on and what we evaluate on is given this story information based on the true book, just the book in our dataset, we generate a next chapter without seeing like the true next chapter, just we generate two next chapters and then we compare them against our baselines.
Okay. I'll still ask questions. I'm still kind of confused, but yeah, I'll
is it? Yeah. I can continue and then you could ask later. Maybe some of the baselines will make it clearer. All right. Are there any other questions? Oh. Okay. I'll move on. So yeah, we have three baselines that we compare against. This is the most basic baseline. This is essentially just next chapter prediction. So we have our book, our true book from our dataset. We split it into chapters and create the story information. Each of these story informations per chapter is fed to our story generator, which produces the next chapter. Our next baseline is our baseline with reasoning. This is if we don't train our policy model at all, we set it equal to our story generator. How much does reasoning help? This is similar-ish to the existing story generation work, where you just prompt your model with some inductive bias about what your models should do for reasoning. How well does that help you? And then finally, I don't have a nice graphic for this, but you do SFT. SFT is sort of the basic, oh, I want to train my story generator. I have some prompt completion data set. What if I just do SFT on it? How do we evaluate the generated stories? So we give all of our human annotators the existing story information we have, the same information we give to the model, and then we give them two story continuations, two next chapters, given this information. And then we ask them to compare, we use a Bradley-Terry model across the following metrics. So plot, does the plot move forward logically? Creativity, does the chapter contain creative and novel elements? Character, are the characters believable and consistent? Development, are the developments detailed and complex? Language, is the language varied and rich? And overall quality. Obviously, we care about overall quality the most, but these other metrics are useful. They're also pulled from previous work to see what is actually changing in our next chapters that is inducing this preference in overall quality. So
I have a question here. My understanding is that, I don't know if I can call it like the chapter context length of this model is 2 chapters, right?
Oh, so what do you mean by chapter context?
By that I mean at each given point during training, the model will get information about the previous chapter and the next chapter, right?
There's also global info.
Yeah, so they get
So-
the all of these things. So they'll get the global story sketch. This is some information about
Nice.
what happens throughout. Yeah, the prior story summaries, which is all of the previous. So if I'm at chapter N and I'm predicting N+1, this is a summary of the previous N chapters. And then the character sheets, which are also based on the previous N chapters, and then the current.
And you take the global story sketch also from the super story.
Yeah,
then?
yeah, super summary. Yeah. So
And
it's
how
not
big is
directly
it?
from them. Sorry.
Go on.
It's not directly from them, but we have the per chapter summaries, and so we just do a summary of those summaries, if that makes sense. There are other ways to do it, but this makes all of the information a similar style, which we hypothesize to be helpful, as opposed to sometimes you would find certain books have different styles of overarching summaries of the book. If you ever look on like Wikipedia summaries of books, they vary wildly in style and content and at specificity. So this way, they're all very similar. But that's the idea.
Okay, but when you evaluate, you give the annotator as a single chapter, right?
The human evaluators see all of this story information and the next chapter.
Okay, I see.
The reason we do that is because it would take them far too long to read the book, but it's
So-
unclear. Sorry?
Yeah, I think that makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, and then it also gives them enough context to say that, oh, this next chapter doesn't make sense because this character wouldn't do that, or because this event has already happened in the summary or something like that. If you just give them the next chapter, sometimes something fantastical and interesting might happen, but if it's already happened, then it's not actually a good continuation, and so you need to adjust for that. Okay, I think I was here. Or are there any other questions?
Did you also evaluate against the ground truth?
We did. It's not in the paper, although I think we have a line about it. The model written stories are always worse. No one ever likes them. This is actually one of the complaints of the reviewers, which they say that means our method doesn't work. I think it is a very hard task, and the human written stories are also much better stylistically, which you can immediately tell whenever you're reading them. I would like, obviously, to get to that point, but I think that will take also optimizing the story generator to produce more interesting looking stories.
That's such a ridiculous reviewer criticism. That's basically saying incremental improvements are not acceptable. We will only accept this if you are 0 to 1.
Yeah, we were not a fan, but yeah, it doesn't mean you haven't solved the task yet. You haven't gotten human comparable.
Yeah.
story.
Oh, you're only better than all the baselines. You're not better than the gold standard.
You need a data set of really bad books.
That is
Yes.
true.
Train on the good books and test on the bad books.
Yes, indeed. Anyway, sorry. Continue on.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, I'll quickly go over the results and then there'll be time for more questions. So the headline result is that reasoning improves performance and training improves reasoning. So this plot is the relative strength from the Bradley-Terry model across each of the metrics. So on the x-axis is each of the metrics we're evaluating. On the y-axis is the relative strength. So Zoom has prevented me from seeing exactly what all of the metrics in order are on the bottom, but it goes like plot, character, creativity, development, language overall, I think. And then on the leftmost is the baseline. This is no reasoning, just prompt the model to produce the next chapter. Then it's baseline with reasoning. This is you produce some amount of reasoning and then the next chapter. Then SFT, which you'll notice is terrible. And then the RL baseline, or not baseline, this is our method, which as you can see performs the best across all of our metrics. The sort of, I think, high-level takeaway, the reasoning improves performance, is that the baseline with reasoning is better than the baseline. So our inductive bias that producing plans does make sense. It does produce preferred chapters. And then further training on our objective further improves on that reasoning. So it makes sense that our VRCLI setup, and as we'll see later, our assumption does hold true, that this is something to hill climb that doesn't rely on significant rewards, but does produce preferred chapters. As I mentioned, SFT does drastically overfit. This is, I think, almost entirely a function of us having a very small data set. We see significant evidence of mode collapse here. Please don't read this. The high-level point is they'll often find chapters generated where it starts looking kind of reasonable, and then we'll say, oh, Jacob is seeing a bunch of cabins. He sees a red one, a blue one, a green one, a yellow one, a pink one, and so on and so on. We try and filter these as much as possible, but it crops up all the time. Sometimes you set an entropy threshold, it's just above it, and you get it. And obviously the humans hate this because they see this. This is not a chapter. What are you talking about? We also, so all of our other experiments are with a 7B model. We also do our same experiments, but with a 3 billion model, and we find worse, but still positive results. So the preferences are less clear, and you'll see that the relative strengths are all much closer to each other. So it's fewer big gaps in preference. However, we do still broadly find that the baseline with reasoning is better than the baseline. Ignore SFT, it's still bad. And then that the our method is still better than the baseline with reasoning, especially overall, but it's less true among some of the subcategories. We have some hypotheses as to why this is the case. There's other work that says smaller models just aren't as capable of reasoning, although there was a paper that came out this week that says, oh, you should just train it for thousands of episodes and you'll figure it out eventually. I think at the very least, it's clear to say that at the base task, we also ran experiments where we just compare 7 billion base generations to 3 billion base generations, and the 3 billion ones were always preferred. So if you have the human, always preferred over the 7 billion, 7 billion, always preferred over the 3 billion. So it's possible that the 3 billion models are just so much significantly worse at extracting useful information from the context and at writing interesting stories that separating these different settings is much harder. We also run some, oh yeah, sorry.
To clarify, you're saying you used a 3 billion parameter model both as the policy and the generator in the 3D experiment?
Yeah, so for the 3 billion settings, they're all of the models are 3 billion for base reasoning, SFT, and RL. And for 7 billion, they're all 7 billion, both the policy and the story generator.
Is the policy model, do you SFT before RL?
No, so we use the instruct model, so it's like can follow the instructions. The SFT is on such a small data set that I think you would have to do a tiny amount of SFT, and even then I'm not sure you would get significant benefit, especially for the policy model, because we don't have any ground truth reasoning traces or plans. Maybe doing a tiny amount of SFT on the story generation model is useful, but as you can see, the SFT model in general performs terribly. This is with taking the best validation loss. It still does very bad. If you had a larger data set, that would be something to look into. Right. I only have a couple more slides before I go to the extra findings, so I'll jump over them. The first is one issue other story generation models find or papers find is that humans are really prefer like longer chapters, these kind of surface level differences in sort of sway the human annotators more than we would like. And so because we're not optimizing our story generator, we don't find that to be the case, with the exception of SFT. The SFT stories are bad, but the surface level differences between both our baselines and our method are very small. So the length of the stories is not very different, and the number of unique tokens is not very different. Even the overlap with the context is not especially different, which we hypothesize to indicate, although it's hard to evaluate this directly, that this implies the content of the stories is what is better. So our plans are, in fact, changing the content of these stories, which people agree with more. And then we also do some small evaluations. I would take these with a grain of salt, but over genres. And we find that genres like sci-fi and fantasy improve the most from reasoning, even without training. And then we find that using our training method, this is the RL column, further improves the reasoning even further beyond their already improvement. This, I think, kind of fits with our intuition that sci-fi and fantasy often involve worlds with significantly different rules and often very complicated and specific situations that don't take place in other books. And so you might need to pay more attention to your context. But again, I'll take these with a small grain of salt. The big question that I think this plot also poses, though, is we're measuring this percent improvement in perplexity across these chapters. However, we haven't fully validated our assumption, even though we've shown that training with our objective produces preferred chapters. Those our core assumption still needs validating. And we do this by taking a variant of our assumption and asking the question, do plans with higher improvement scores produce preferred completions? So now we have annotations where we have a produced plan and its hypothetical improvement of a goal chapter. Is the actual chapter we generated preferred over baselines? And we find that, yes, it is preferred. We find a statistically significant spearmint rank correlation, which is a nice, we've already shown that training with this method produces preferred chapters, but this is a nice justification that, yes, for this task, this way of framing it makes sense. And this is a good metric to use as the basis for our reward. So that brings me to the conclusions of at least this paper. The high-level 3 big takeaways is one, I think fairly obvious that next chapter prediction as a variant of this book generation task is more evaluatable. It breaks down book length generations into more evaluatable chunks. And then second, that VRCLI, which is our new reward paradigm, is a useful reward paradigm for training on completion data sets where you don't have obvious rewards, especially like creative writing. And then finally, that training with this method produces preferred chapters across a variety of metrics. And yeah, I think I think we have time. I don't fully. It ends at
Oh yeah, we
11:30 for
have
us.
like this goes until the half hour, so we
Until
have
the half
plenty.
hour. Okay, good. The time zone difference is messing me up a little. But okay, so these will be very short. I just think they're a nice, so like I said, things you won't see in the paper. So we split on chapters, but there's kind of an obvious other idea is, well, maybe producing shorter chunks is even more easily to evaluate, and maybe it's even easier to get better reward improvements. So maybe you should just train on that. And this is an ongoing set of experiments, but we do find that this is true with the heavy caveat that the hyperparameters I mentioned before of your specific reward thresholds, these are the piecewise function based on your improvement, they can lead to reasoning mode collapse if you aren't careful. So you don't need to read this whole reasoning trace, but this is the plan it generates. And you will notice, at least at a high level, it doesn't mention anything specific about this book at all. It is just very generic writing advice. And we find that if you cap the amount of reward you get from this improvement too low, it will sometimes just give always the same advice to every book. And if you just include this as part of your prompt, you can get better performance. You should just do that, create a better prompt, and then continue with your actual task. This is a sort of more higher level difference, is the inspiration from this work came from latent variable modeling. It came from this paper, Amortizing Intractable Inference for Large Language Models. I think there's been a lot of talk, especially recently, about the possibilities of entropy collapse or entropy minimization during reasoning, and whether that's the thing you should optimize. I don't think it is, but some people say that. I think reframing this as, instead of necessarily reasoning, instead you're just trying to generate something that increases the likelihood of your output thing, is a useful framing because it allows you to take inspiration from a bunch of other areas of latent variable modeling, which have already looked at these tasks, because you don't necessarily care whether your model is reasoning or not. I mean, some people do, but I think at large, what you want is something that increases the likelihood of predicting the right answer or producing good chapters and things like that. And so this paper uses G-flow nets, which is one way of ensuring reasoning diversity, but there's other methods that would apply as well. And then finally, I think there's an interesting, especially potentially to you all, question about when the improvement assumption isn't true. And so we used to work, it's funny you all mentioned about you should just train on or test on bad stories. We used to use a different story data set that was more crowdsourced stories. And we found that some of the completions weren't actually story text. They're just people talking to their friends or something on this website. And we found that just a small set of these bad examples could completely destabilize our training, because your plans, no matter what they were, would always decrease the likelihood of this gold bad completion. And so your model would just learn to stop outputting good reasoning and good story text, even though this was a relatively small subset of the data set. And so we ended up switching data sets and doing a bunch of filtering. We found that to be particularly useful, especially for this low data domain where you're sampling over the same completions a lot. Secondly, there's this question about length normalization. So we use perplexity. However, the variance in your potential of perplexity is still influenced by how long a chapter is. So if you have a chapter that's 10,000 words versus a chapter that's 10 words, you're going to get much more variance in your perplexity improvement on the 10 words versus the 10,000 words. As a result, there's some question about whether you should do curriculum learning or better data sampling to actually improve the stability of your training. So you can still use both of these data points, but potentially at different parts of your training to allow you to be stable and not overfit to the small data points where you're getting the most reward. So this is something we're thinking about, but I'm sure there's a lot of other people who do all kinds of curriculum learning, especially for math tasks where the kind of difficult math problems are often so much harder than the easy math problems that you can get destabilized training when you include both of them in the same batch.
So I think it seems like there's a fairly, I mean, at least a more intuitive notion of difficulty for math problems. How would you define difficulty in the story generation sense?
It is difficult. I think there is a similar approach that you can take from some of the math problems. I think it was the Kimi 1.5 paper where they, within a batch, they basically say for every sample, I generate 8 completions. Let's say 40% of those are correct and under 80% or something, then that's something I should include. You can have a similar concept here where you have some bounded percent improvements. I do think the percent improvements do vary a lot based on your length, so it is much harder. But I think that's like a very naive and fairly abstract way of looking at it. Something we had talked about, which I don't think would work, but might, is you can look at like children's books. Like we have already some concept of difficulty in how hard it is to read a book. maybe, you know, there's like children's books and then there's like hard sci-fi or something where it's really important you know what is happening in the context. Maybe you can kind of guide the training over the course of like using this kind of reading level difficulty as a metric. But I'm somewhat suspicious, but we'll see. It's a good question. I don't think I have a great answer on this thing would work.
Interesting.
Go back. The questions. Did that clear up the? Sorry, I was just going to ask. Did that clear up the confusion about where the next chapters came from?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I suppose I have one question that's open here, which like you're primarily applying in the space of you know, you're able to create all of these previous summaries and like next chapter and start learning in this space. Do you feel your method like you've pretty much set it up such that your method could be applied to other areas, but you don't really go too deep into what you think those other areas might be. I'm curious if there's something that like stands out to you besides the norm of like what people have already been using RL for that you think this would be particularly useful in.
So I have thought about it a bit because my area is more in story generation. That is the area I know the most about. So I would take any of my intuition with a heavy grain of salt when it comes to other things. Summarization is, I think, also one of those obvious tasks where you often have gold quality summarizations, but you don't often have a good idea of what makes those good. And there's a lot of high quality summaries out there that may differ in style or might differ in, you know, specificity and things like that. And often people use Rouge and these kind of like high level metrics that already aren't great. I think this is an obviously applicable version of this task. There's other tasks like translation, which suffer from similar issues of how do you compare against this ground truth completion. I think in theory, at least, you can apply this to a lot of tasks, even ones that are traditionally, I would say, easy, like math. I think I have possibly a slide here. This is just in the appendix. These are some recent papers that came out that all, I think, apply to basic question answering and math tasks in general, but they will have a similar idea of using some concept of the likelihood of this completion as a learning signal. Some of them add an SFT objective, some of them don't. It varies a lot. But I think one of the advantages of framing this as a likelihood problem, but from the reward perspective, as opposed from the SFT objective, is you get a nicer representation of the problem where you're trying to generate an intermediary thing that helps you predict the output thing, not the output thing directly, which is very prone to overfitting. Like if you train directly on translations, you often overfit to sort of spurious correlations of the specific word use and things like that, as opposed to saying, oh, these are the concepts that you're trying to translate, for example, that might be helpful in your translation. That's my high level guess.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely relevant and something we think about internally. One of the things we do quite a bit of is like synthetic data generation and knowing how to generate good synthetic data is one of those tasks that you don't really have you know, a specific reward or like an exact answer for. So it's you know, I can see summarization and translation both being a potential place to try this out.
Yeah.
Did you say you also ran experiments where you also train the generator as well as the policy with the same objective? And if so, do you remember?
So
share some of the results there.
I don't think we didn't. There are, I think, I can't remember. I believe Verifree basically does. Because for many tasks, like for example, a math task, it doesn't make sense to load one model to reason and one model to produce your answer. You'd rather just have one model that's good at both. And so if you were to reframe what their approach is in our VRCLI setup, they train the generator and the policy at the same time. We don't, because we have this heavy prior that generating stories at the same time is quite bad as producing reasoning because the stylus are different. And really the kind of implicit tasks are also different. But if I had to guess, you would destabilize training. You know, there's another question of we have this nice improvement. I don't remember where I put it, but that we only need to load the reference model, which we already are doing. But there's some work that says, well, actually, you don't need a reference model. You should just set your KL coefficient to 0, in which case you don't get this savings improvement. I think having it be purposely vague about what your generator is potentially a big advantage, but I don't have a great intuition about what, I think if you were training your story generator at the same time as your policy, you would need another objective to ensure that your story generator is also good. Because otherwise I think it would just destabilize. This is my guess.
I mean, you have the data to do next token prediction for the generator as well, right? Because it's the same data.
Yeah, saying we have the data, I think might overstate the size of the data set. I think we do have data set of that format, but as our show with our SFT baseline, just training on that objective is very bad. Maybe doing them both at the same time is enough, or maybe having like a coefficient on your SFT that is extremely small might be enough. I'm not sure. But yeah, I think for this specific task where you have a tiny amount of data, SFT objectives are a little suspicious to me.
Alex, did you ever like conceptualize this, like using a good prompt from a planning model versus no prompt as a way to create like preference data at scale?
Sorry, can you give a good prompt from the...
Like earlier you talked about like, oh, we don't have very much preference data, so we're going to do it this other way. But once you run this a bunch of times, hypothetically, right, you've gotten a good policy model, and then you can turn it off, and now you have clear like better versus worse at as much scale as you want to generate. Would that be useful, or is it just kind of like no better than just kind of the two model solution?
My guess is it's no better than the two model solution. There's a version of this where this is common for DPO and RLHF as well, where you just set your gold completion as your preferred completion, and then whatever you generate as the dispreferred completion, and you just optimize that. But you end up with the same problem of an implicit or an explicit reward model, which maybe if you're using a much bigger model would be better. But at least at this stage, most of the reward models are pretty bad. I think you would at the very least need to continually monitor your reward model and retrain it and make sure that it's not being reward hacked and things like that. But it is an interesting idea because training on our GRPO with VRCLI setup is very expensive. We would like to not do it if possible, but it seems to be the best way to get as much out of the data that we have. So yeah, maybe reframing it after some amount of training would be good.
Any final questions? So I have one, which I'm curious. It seems like in part, this is, well, okay, maybe it's a two-part question. I'm curious, like in part, this seems like a way to leverage the fact that you have extremely limited data. Like, and this is complete, like a complete speculative question, but like, assuming sufficient data, do you think you could just SFT on it and you would get equivalent results to what you've been able to do here? Or do you think there's something fundamentally different about the reinforcement learning process, that you implemented here that would just fundamentally like always get you better results given an equivalent amount of data to train on?
My guess is you would need like many orders of magnitude more data to SFT on. Because I think similar to math, where we have a lot of math questions, just doing SFT on math questions doesn't get you good results. Having giving models space to generate some latent thing that helps you produce it is still helpful. So yeah, my guess is you could spend the time to get a lot of data, or you could spend the time to scale up this kind of training. And I think unless you have like thousands and thousands of times more data, I would guess, and if you did that, what I would guess would be best is to do some amount of SFT and this. I don't think they're necessarily, opposed to each other.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. Are there other sorts of data or tasks that you think could be this approach could be applied to? I think long form story generation, I think it is interesting because it is, it is something that feels very non-verifiable. And so being able to, apply these sorts of approaches like feels very promising. I'm curious if you've thought at all about other domains that this could be applied to.
Yeah, so I think this is a bit similar to Jack's question, where I think summaries and translation are obvious cases. There's also like conversational data where you're having some reasoning that implies a better conversational answer is a little unclear about what that means. Because similarly, you would evaluate conversational data usually on a pairwise fashion. I think part of the advantage of the approach is you could apply it to anything. What makes sense to, in my mind, is at most the places where if you don't have some, like you said, well-defined metric of quality, then it makes sense to do. I think a lot of long-form text answers are like that, whether it's, like I said, summarization, all of this, but also just most long-form text output, aside from maybe code, is very difficult to verify because unlike short answers, which you can usually compare against some reference, long answers, even comparing against a reference is quite hard, which is why we use Rouge and Blur and stuff like that.
Yep. That makes sense. Cool. Thank you. I think we're about at time, so I will ask everyone to thank Alex for his great talk and thorough question answering and discussion.
Yes, thank you all for having me. It was fun.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.